รายการต่อไปนี้เป็นรายการทั่วไปสามารถรับชมได้ทุกวัย
สนับสนุนโดย AIS ใช้ชีวิตได้มากกว่าใหม่ MG3 ชีวิตไหนสไตล์ไหนก็ฟันยกระดับความแรงและทนด้วย FB Premium Go SMF FB แบตเตอรี่ไฟดีไม่มีทรยศนุสา My Ozone คิดให้ชีวิตสมบูรณ์แบบ
การประชุมนานาชาติครั้งที่ 5 ของสมาคมกฎหมายระหว่างประเทศแห่งเอเชียนับเป็นการประชุมเชิงวิชาการด้านกฎหมายระหว่างประเทศที่สำคัญอย่างมากในภูมิภาคเอเชียซึ่งทางสมาคมจัดขึ้นทุก 2 ปีครั้งในประเทศของผู้ที่ได้รับเลือกตั้งเป็นประธานในช่วง 2 ปีนั้นซึ่งผลัดเปลี่ยนหมุนเวียนไปตามประเทศต่างๆในเอเชียในครั้งนี้คือประเทศไทยการประชุมครั้งนี้ได้รับเกียรติจากบุคคลสำคัญระดับโลกหลายท่านที่ให้เกียรติกล่าวสุนทรพจน์นำอาทิผู้พิพากษาศาลยุติธรรมระหว่างประเทศได้แก่ท่านผู้พิพากษาฮิซาชิโอวาดะอดีตประธานศาลยุติธรรมระหว่างประเทศซึ่งดำรงตำแหน่งเป็นประธานองค์คณะผู้พิพากษาในคดีปราสาทพระวิหารและท่านผู้พิพากษาซือหันจิ้นสมาชิกในองค์คณะผู้พิพากษาศาลยุติธรรมระหว่างประเทศในปัจจุบันและเป็นสมาชิกในองค์คณะผู้พิพากษาในคดีปราสาทพระวิหารด้วยและยังได้รับเกียรติจากนายชอกัตอาซิสอดีตนายกรัฐมนตรีปากีสถานและนายโฮเซอิซิโดรลิโตคามาโชอดีตรัฐมนตรีคลังของฟิลิปปินส์และศาสตราจารย์ดร.สุรเกียรติเสถียรไทยประธานเอเชียนซิลและอดีตรองนายกรัฐมนตรีและรัฐมนตรีต่างประเทศของไทย
The purpose of international law is to try to solve problems that exist in society where human beings live.
But in terms of terrorism and extremism, once we address the root causes, then we have to see how we can work with other countries so that it doesn't spread to other countries.
The exchange of information is also the most important instrument against terrorism today, and there are legal instruments that facilitate the exchange of information between states. It's a very delicate issue.
Terrorism act might have been prevented but not reported because international law has helped prevent it. So it's not a story because it was prevented successfully. That's why it is the role of international law that is not publicized. Lucy?
That's very true, and there's very little I can add to this discussion. But I'm confident from my time in our State Department there are many terrorist plans that are learned about and avoided, and we don't hear about it. But in the course of fighting terrorism, which by definition is use of force against innocent victims unpredictably, not legitimate targets of war. And there is a whole framework for war, for where there can be use of force and where you can defend yourself, a state with force. But what we will be seeing, and we're already seeing it in Paris, is a shifting into what many people will consider to be an invasion of their rights to privacy and human rights in the effort by the international organizations and the French police, other domestic police, to apprehend terrorists before they can attack. And this is another area where international law has a very rich matrix of protections. There are certain things in international law by treaty or by practice that are forbidden on technically in all nations, like piracy, like slavery, which we could get into human trafficking, torture, but the protections for privacy and the human right to privacy is going to be subject to national security, and there are different international norms, national norms, I should say, for that. So be prepared for a lot of backlash. Is what I have to say.
It's a very important point. I think the public should know international role in fighting against terrorism. For instance, if a terrorist suspect escaped from the crime scene, go to another country.
Yes.
Under international law, wherever this person goes, the country where he is found must be, obliged to persecute him and punish him. This is the basic principle of international law. So there's no impunity whatsoever for terrorists.
So wherever you commit the crime in the global world, you are caught anywhere. You can be caught and prosecuted anywhere.
Yes.
But that's what the law says. But when it's not followed by the country where a terrorist
a country's
is found.
following it?
Well, this is something as we go deeper fighting terrorism. This is something the international community must come to consensus if you want to succeed in fighting against terrorism.
As in your domestic society, so is international society. You have to think about this problem separately. One is the question of the regulatory framework to prevent and punish crimes, certain types of crimes, not just crimes, but also certain infringement of rights, like climate change, human rights issues. Now, in the domestic context, you have the regulatory framework which controls, maintains the order in society.
Yes.
But at the same time, you have to attack the root cause of those things. These two have to go together.
I see.
And in exactly the same way in the international community, now that the world has become a global world, global community, you have to have this regulatory framework covering all over the world.
Right.
But at the same time, you have to have the root causes which have to be attacked on an individual basis at different regions and different countries and so forth. So this is a combination of the two. International law protects you just as domestic legal system protects your human security and ensures your prosperity. In very much the same way in the global world, international law tries to secure your safety and at the same time to promote your welfare and prosperity by encouraging certain activities like financial, banking, etc., all these things. So you should not think that international law is something alien to you. It's very much the same as the domestic regulatory systems that you have in your own
Just
society.
like you, it's a global nation.
Yeah.
Whatever happens locally, at the international level,
Yeah.
that is exactly the same.
Exactly.
Except that it's a much bigger family, right? You would add something?
Yes, very quickly. I think this whole issue of tackling terrorism and the role of the state, first of all, the need for human intelligence cannot be overemphasized. We need human intelligence to really be in the preventive mode of knowing things before they happen. Secondly, use of technology. Both are independently necessary. Human intelligence, if you have the right sources, can really give you very rich information before an event takes place. Secondly, use of technology, monitoring various issues. Now, where international cooperation comes in is sometimes the technology and the information may be outside your jurisdiction. So that speed of action has to be instantaneous.
Yes.
And third is that when you talk about terrorism, as my colleagues just said, the source of funding is key.
Yes.
And those who are funding are equally responsible for terrorist acts as the people committing them. So there we have tightened up a lot as a system of finance and banking, but there's always room for improvement. More can be done. Because movement of money can tell you how this is being sort of talked about. Now, if you see what happened in Paris and the speed of the way the police reacted and got to a location where a lot of the planners were there, tells you that their human intelligence among other intelligence,
Yes.
was pretty good because they targeted a place which gave them
They even know which apartment to attack.
absolutely, and so all those things, and you have in this business, security business, you get a lot of leads. The filtering of that, you can't follow 500 leads a day. No
Right.
country has the capacity, or 5,000 as the case may be. So the filtering of that is important. The cooperation with everybody is important, and there is no one formula to it. The key is right from the leadership of the country down to every member of civil society. We as citizens of the world must be aware of these threats and be able to take action quickly. And the last thing is implementation of policies and laws is the key.
Yes.
There's a framework of good laws, regulations, rules all over the world. Some countries implement it very well. Some have a lot more to do. That requires resources, training, the human capital to do all this. So all those administrative matters become very important in a situation of extremism, terrorism. And lastly, the people we are dealing with in this situation are sometimes irrational. You cannot apply logic and a rational approach to predict what will be done next. So that's why it becomes much more difficult, because they may have a mindset which is totally different than anybody sitting around this table. So that is more challenging than the ordinary situation where people have a way of reacting and acting.
So am I
Can
right?
I add just one point? What Joshua and some of us talked about international law in this regard. I think the international law, meaning international treaties, international conventions, regional conventions to tackle terrorism or the financing of terrorism, like Secretary Camacho said, are important foundation for emphasizing on the present-day cooperation. So what I mean is that you may have United Nations General Assembly resolution, which may not be legally binding like international law, but then the United Nations resolution can base on obligations of countries under, say, 15 international conventions, reiterating the importance of the existing international conventions against terrorism, calling upon all 190-something countries to work together. Or when ASEAN leaders, 10 of ASEAN leaders met last week, they reiterated the importance of working together, referring to various regional conventions, international treaties, and based on those legal ground, which is called international law, that ASEAN countries can work together. We can expand that to East Asia Summit, where you have United States, where you have India, Korea, Japan, China working together, and then again commit to a cooperation. So the cooperation is more secret, sacred, if it is based on the existing international legal obligation. And that's the role of international law that can reiterate or can emphasize the cooperation, especially on the issue of terrorism, anti-terrorism.
Am I right?
International law, in another sense, is simply something ready, set of rules and regulations, conventions. It's an evolving matter. In the process, you always face challenges. For instance, just now Lucy mentioned, you have the obligation, but if a state or certain state fail to fulfill its obligation, in terms of sharing of intelligence, if states do not share, and also the root cause, how can you do that? They concern world peace, security, national policy, all things come together. So it's not something when you talk about terrorism, it's one single issue as such.
Right.
So you really need coherent approach, in the synergy, and the international community have to come to consensus and to tackle the issue from different aspects. So this is one example. Actually, many examples, many cases, many issues of international law we face today all have the same features. You know, this is something when we talk about it, maybe people in the street think this is international something so far away from us.
Right.
But actually, the moment you are going to step out of your country, you have to rely on international law every step of the way, starting from the passport you hold, starting from the travel tickets you are using,
or the airline you take.
The airline you take, and your nationality. That means you're protected by your country, and the privilege immunities you're supposed to entitled to as a diplomat. When you do business, you're expecting regulations. You're expecting your investment to be protected. So for ordinary people, international law means really serious to them. But when they feel international does not exist, means international works. When you feel problem, that means international failed. You have to address it.
The question I have is
ช่วงหน้า
if there is non-compliance or violation to international law or international treaties or practices. For example, if a state decides to be a safe haven for terrorists, what is the punishment? We know in domestic cases, you have the court makes a decision, the police can implement and execute the judgment. In international law, who's the police?
สนับสนุนโดย AIS ใช้ชีวิตได้มากกว่า Rockwood เชื่อว่าบรรยากาศของออฟฟิศที่ดีมีผลต่อการดึงศักยภาพที่ซ่อนอยู่ออกมา JSP City สุขุมวิทแพร่กษาทาวน์โฮม4 ห้องนอนเริ่ม 1.64 ล้าน by JSP Property.
But when they feel international does not exist, means international works. When you feel problem, that means international failed. You have to address it.
In fact, I was going to say when the American Society had its 100th anniversary, we published this little book called 100 Ways International Law Affects Your Life.
Really? That is
and
interesting.
It's things like being able to mail a letter from New York to Bangkok and getting the internet addresses that you have, the EDUs and the COMs. They're all, everything around us is a web now. But I was noticing with interest, your questions tend to be, how can international law solve our problems?
Right. I think that's the common people's question.
But it also sets out the framework.
Mr. Ticha, if I may just add, not an answer, but a question. As a non-lawyer and as a layman, you know, it would sound like international law can address a lot of issues, including terrorism.
Yes.
Question I have is, if there is non-compliance or violation to international law or international treaties or practices, for example, if a state decides to be a safe haven for terrorists, what is the
punishment?
What is the punishment? We know in domestic cases, you have the court makes a decision, the police can implement and execute the judgment. In international law, who's the police?
Who is the police? Judges?
Well, there is not.
No police.
There is no police.
No international police.
No police.
But
you cannot go to the Interpol.
No. The Interpol will go against people that are committing crimes. But when a state does not fulfill its obligations under international law, it incurs into international responsibility. And there are ways to ask for this responsibility. It has a duty that can be established before an international court, or the other states can adopt countermeasures. So to take measures that are lawful under international law, but that will punish that state. And there can be retaliation if it does not involve the use of force. and there can be sanctions, which are collective measures taken by the international community against that state. Sanctions may involve the use of force if the Security Council authorizes it, or those sanctions may be economic sanctions, political sanctions, boycotts. So there are a lot of measures that can be taken to press a state to fulfill its obligation and its obligations under international law.
I think it's quite misleading to answer your question in a straightforward yes or no. In a very strict sense, if you compare the international community with the domestic community, yes, there is no such central power as the police in a particular state. It doesn't mean that there is no regulatory framework which involves certain degree of punishment or quasi-punishment. I mean, Professor Martinez has really spoken various examples. I think that, of course, you have to admit that the world we live in now are still based on sovereign nation states, and therefore there is a partition of competence by different states. So there is no central authority which can impose the will of the community in the name of the community as a whole. But nevertheless, there are constraints coming from the consensus of the world community, which surfaces in the form of sanctions, United Nations resolutions, and many other things which compel the state. I mean, if you take an example of an individual criminal, they are punished by international law, like the ICC, International Criminal Court, or the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. So these are done, but when the state itself is involved, as the question was put, then of course there is no such thing which can impose in the will of the community upon a state in a very direct way, but nevertheless there are constraints which compels the state to obey.
Indeed, there is no world government.
No world government yet.
This is one important difference we have to explain to the public, because public tend to think in the way as in the national state, as Jose Isidro explained. And to answer the question, of course, first of all, you have to see whether that the very state has accepted certain international treaties or convention under which it has undertaken the obligation to punish certain aspect. You know, this is an important thing. For international law, there are two main sources for law. One's international treaties, whether if you are a party, certainly you are under international obliged to do that, certain things. Second one is customary international law. Principles, rules as recognized by international community as a whole. So there are conditions. When you say certain things, you have to put it in a particular context, particular case. But it doesn't mean if you are not a party to a certain treaty, you say, oh, international law has no teeth. It doesn't bite. That's not true either. Because when you come to certain things, for instance, that concerns the interests of international community, of course, as a government, you cannot simply neglect what other countries say or public opinion is. You always try to see what would be the best way to fulfill the objective. So, in other words, for us as international lawyers, we should promote international law. You know, for those important treaties, we should promote, let most countries to be a party to those treaties.
So you cannot be a bad guy. If you're a bad guy, you won't be left alone, right?
Well, if I may be provocative, Kusatichai, but it appears that, you know, in some instances, you know, working to depose the regime might be the solution that the rest of the world would do, as we have seen in certain parts of the world.
There's a very important aspect which I'd like to share with all of you, that increasingly, when you talk about the phenomena of terrorism, extremism, and other events taking place around us, the role of non-state actors is really pivotal in creating the problems which are being created now.
Sure.
We are talking mostly about normal situations, but in the real world today, the non-state actors are actually the drivers of a lot of these issues and challenges which we've talked about. To them, no law applies. For example, if you are sitting in the hills somewhere 500 miles from the nearest telephone, in this case, and somebody says, we'll put sanctions on you, we'll do to that country, they have no access there. So the point is, we have to look at these issues a bit more practical, in a practical manner. And there are examples where we have imposed sanctions, we meaning the world, on a particular area. But they are non-state actors who are not in control of anybody, and they have their own networks. They don't recognize anybody's sovereign right. They do what they have to do. Who would you impose sanctions on? Because the state, if there is any around them, cannot do anything anyway. And lot of these are also moving targets. So if a country, if they have the writ and they are aiding and abetting something which is wrong, then those sanctions will work, of course. But in many cases, we have found that the person you want to put sanctions on, or the entity, or they don't deal with banks.
Yes.
They don't deal with organized networks. They don't use communications which can be intercepted because they have couriers.
Right.
I mean, there are many things in the real world which are happening today.
So you're suggesting international law cannot touch them?
ติดตามต่อ
International law
วัน
is
พรุ่งนี้
concerned, there's no such thing as a no man's land. Every single square inch in this world comes under international law.